Right. Well, thank you. And good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this chilly morning in Gauteng. But I know we've got people from all over that is joining us, especially a big welcome to Matt from the UK, from London, from Willis Towers Watson for joining us today. You're going to hear quite a bit from Matt this morning, and we're looking forward to that. Gloria, can you please mute on your side?
Yeah, bro. Come see.
Gloria, can you please mute? Sorry, I'm on speaker view, so I can't see Gloria's screen to mute her. Okay, so welcome everybody, and we're very excited. This is a very, very big week for WorldsView Academy. For those of you that's known us for a while, you would know that we're very passionate about helping organizations become more effective in a healthy way. And true to that purpose of ours, we have now partnered with Willis Towers Watson to bring you the Employee Engagement and Experience Certification, a first of its kind, definitely in South Africa, I think for large parts of the world. And for us, as you know, we also do quite a bit of training in the OD space. We do a lot of development work in the OD space. And we really are excited about bringing you this new certification and opening up a whole new world for us. Just for us in terms of the subjects and the topics that we like to talk about at our OD talks and our newsletters. This has definitely opened up a bigger world for us. And we're just so super excited to do this. Our newsletter went out yesterday. That's where all of you would have heard about the topic of the talk this week. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the subject today, and there'll be time for some questions and answers at the end. I think, Christo, if I'm right, like the last 15 minutes or so?
Yeah, and we'll start with some questions.
Okay. As always, we'll start
as always.
Something interactive. Please, as we go through the session, you're welcome to put some questions in the chat function. Both me and Christo will look out for that. Or just put up your hand if you want to say something. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Christo and Matt.
Good. Thanks, Liesel. Good morning, everyone. It's quite exciting to sit here and to Matt. I mean, we've had quite a few conversations over the last few months, working through this. I mean, it's been an interesting and challenging in some respects journey for me as well. What initially drew me was, I think, employee engagement, employee experience, to a large extent comes from a certain kind of an HR space. And here we sit in organization development, and in organization development, how can I put it? We're sometimes a little bit at odds with HR, because we have the sense that HR tries to keep the organization as it is, and we try to make the organization different. And when I heard about, you know, when this came on our path, I was thinking, okay, so what would an organization development approach be to this question of employee engagement and employee experience? And we worked through the Willis Towers Watson approach, but at the same time bringing to it the WorldsView Academy approach to organization development and organization transformation. So we'll explore a little bit more about this morning. But before we do so, we need to do the organization development thing, which is to put you in the rooms and to let you have conversations with each other and meet each other and just explore a little bit. So, Liesel, I think about 3-4 people per room. Don't know how.
Okay.
And then just asking you to introduce yourself to each other. And the question I have for you this morning is, what is it about employee engagement experience that brings you to this conversation? Are there specific questions that you have? And how do you understand this thing? Why is it important? So I know I'm guilty of a relatively open and vague question that is partly purposeful. And we'll see you back in about 10 to 12 minutes.
Okay, rooms are opening. There you go.
Excellent, good. Did you have a good conversation? I'd love to hear from, let's say, 2 or 3 people, and then anyone who wants to add. Some of the key thoughts, questions that came up for you in your groups.
Well, I'll start. I think the difficulty is just how do you engage in a remote setting? That sounds very obvious, but particularly because we in Gauteng, in South Africa, are facing this steep rise, which is probably going to put paid to ideas of going back to office. Whereas I think other parts of the world are potentially starting to really think about going back. Yeah. And I wonder whether we are under an illusion that going back is going to be possible. So we spoke a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Barend. I think also because across the world there will be a shift, I think, to some extent, that people will not entirely co-locate as they used to co-locate in the past. That there will be much more virtual co-working arrangements. And that will definitely have an impact on how we think about how we engage. Thank you.
I was on an international call yesterday, and it was America, and it was interesting how different the context was. Because of their high levels of vaccination, they are now actually contemplating going back, so to speak. And I just realized that we face such a different context suddenly here.
Yeah.
I'll just add one comment here, which is that, you know, particularly in the UK and the US, we're seeing such a confusion amongst organizations that think they're returning and they're backtracking. So we can see a lot of leaders cannot get this right. If you look at Apple, they've faced a huge backlash because they insisted people went back to the office and it's not worked for them. So people are voting with their feet, and we're seeing the pendulum swinging back a bit to, hold on guys, the genie's out of the box. Home working is got to be part of the future. So we don't quite know where the pendulum's going to finally rest, but it's certainly not, from what I'm seeing, it's certainly not back to the office in any way like it used to be.
Yeah, and it's an interesting balance that we will need to strike here. As people, of course, as they work virtually, I think it will create a lot of loneliness and isolation for a lot of people. While at the same time, it's highly desired by a lot of people. So there's some interesting difficulties for organizations to face as far as that's concerned. Good, that's an interesting one. Anyone else?
Yeah, Chris, can I just add to that last part about going organizations? I was listening to a talk by Mark Khan. He's the global head of HR global head of people in organization. And he was saying, like, it's just an illusion that organizations think at some point we'll just go back to normal. Like that actually, that thinking we should do away with, to say, actually, the way of work is going to be uncertain, and there's not going to be any form of going back in a particular way. That's the first part. And then in our group, we spent 10 minutes, or maybe I spent 10 minutes talking about you a little bit, Christu, that I got hooked on something that you said, that, you know, the idea that there's this function of HR and OD. And if I look at some of the research of organizations of the future, that in terms of introducing change and the employee experience, there won't be this idea of HR, OD, and L&D. You know, what organizations need is a people function, and the people function that helps and enables leadership. And if you look at many of the global organizations, and even some here in SA, the idea of there's an HR manager and an OD manager, even those titles has fallen away. Many organizations are now referring to people and organization, you know, because that's the function that you manage. And the idea that there's this HR team that's kind of disabling the process is becoming a little bit obsolete. I'm mindful of my own bias, because in the team they were saying that actually there are still HR teams that are very transactional and a little bit archaic, that are limiting, you know, the work of OD and change. But I do think that the more transformative organizations are doing away with that, and building functions that help and enable business and not limit.
I think that's an interesting angle, Mani, because it asks the question of who's responsible for the employee experience and for employee engagement. Who holds that?
Leadership.
Well, yeah. Yes, and who will help them? Who are going to help them? And we're going to do it just in such a way that we can maintain the status quo, or are we going to do it in such a way that we actually create organizations where people want to be? And when people are invited to participate in the work of the organization. So I think that's an interesting one. I mean, the point around calling it people, that little book that Gallup wrote about employee engagement, probably about 20 years ago, they already made the point that, look, marketing, HR, actually we should get rid of those departments. And move towards people. So, and I think that's a whole big other conversation. But interesting from the point of who's responsible and who's going to do the work. Matt, was there something you wanted to?
Yeah, absolutely. Employee experience. I think just the terminology is putting it much more in the hands of the employee. So I think this is it's an incredible opportunity for people in organizations now, because they have a voice in a way they haven't had a voice before, and that they can leave an organization and they can leave Glassdoor reviews. There's a case here in the UK where 600 ex-workers have forced the CEO to apologize and backtrack on how he managed people. So leaders need to steer the ship for sure. But the power of people in this has never been stronger. I think it's such an exciting time to be an employee in an organization these days.
It's an interesting point. I guess, Matt, from a certain perspective, the first move in this direction was to start focusing on customer experience because of the increased power of the customer or the consumer. And that in a way, the boundary between customer and employee is also disappearing.
Yeah, I think that's.
I mean, there's certain perspectives in HR that sees this as the consumerization of the employee, which is something that I feel deeply uncomfortable with. But yeah.
And I think a direct comparison is not completely fair, because a customer has much more choice. So to treat employees like customers, you can't, unfortunately, just pick up your bags and move to another job, but you could buy another product. So they're not perfectly aligned. But I think some of the fundamental philosophies of it are really interesting to draw those parallels. And we are seeing organizations merging their customer experience and their employee experience departments, functions, to try and see what synergies they can make there. So I don't think it's a perfect crossover, but I think there's really interesting parallels that can be made around, you know, what does it feel like to work here and my choice to go elsewhere.
Yeah, and as always, it depends on the market.
Yeah.
To a large extent.
Totally.
I mean, if you've got employees trapped in a bad job market,
Yeah.
You can get away with a lot more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not for so long, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Christo, if I may,
Yes.
I was in the group with Erica and Beatrice, and Erica and I are both in the mining manufacturing kind of environment where we find that the bureaucracy and the rigid or the stringent way of doing things, especially with the senior leadership, because most of them are baby boomers, and they're finding it difficult to embrace the fourth industrial revolution, finding it a bit of a challenge to accept the millennials and the new way of thinking, and everything must be printed. If it's not in hard copy, it doesn't exist. Whereas the other employees, the younger generation, is saying, I can get it on my tablet, I can get it on my cell phone. And so what we're trying to find from an employee engagement or employment experience perspective is, how do we embrace everybody, that we don't cut or restrict certain groups of the employees out, that the retention, all of a sudden the attrition skyrockets because people feel they don't want to be here, they're not valued. So in the organization that I'm at, we actually in Middelburg steel manufacturing, and we've gone on a drive because we looked at it and we saw we're going to lose key employees. We're going to have a serious challenge with knowledge transfer and the sustainability of development within the organization. And so we've purposefully positioned ourselves to say, let's make the employees part of the journey in identifying what values we subscribe to. The vision was revised, the strategy was revised, the mission was revised, and in this whole process, we've taken the employees along with us so that they feel and they experience that they are part of the solution and they are adding value to the bottom line at the end of the day. So that's more or less the discussion that came through from our group.
That's very interesting, Dustin. And I love what you, because this really brings it into the organization development space. It is that we sit in an organization and there's a real history in the organization. There's a real structural context, and you know, bureaucracies are real. And some people have actually over the years become quite comfortable with bureaucracies, and there's a whole generation and a whole shift of people who are becoming increasingly uncomfortable with bureaucracies.
It's a problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, Christo, building on to what was just said, I fully agree. People are getting a multiple choice questionnaire instead of having conversations, and they're not getting the relevant information about employee engagement, and they're not understanding their people. And the multinationals that I've worked with have even gone so far as taking the results and saying, well, this is within the Gallup norm or the Corn Ferry norm, and then nothing is done about employee engagement. So it becomes a tick box exercise. The other thing that I find is that organizations are not taking into consideration the level of diversity that we have in this country. We have people on a whole lot of different value systems, different cultural norms, different consciousness levels, and they are not all motivated by the same thing. So I'm hearing people say, I'm sick of them throwing money at me every time I want to leave. I really hate my job. Or I'm sick of them promoting me every time I say that I'm happy or I'm disengaged. They expect that everybody needs to be rewarded the same way, which is a problem. And the other problem is we are not like organizations overseas. So we've got a different type of dynamic. One of the companies I work with has a factory as well. They're a manufacturing company. And a lot of the people in the factory are not literate. they've been tested and they have a reading ability of, I think it's a grade 3 or a grade 4. So conversations would be a much more appropriate type of questionnaire to have. It would also build the relationships that are necessary, because people at certain values, on certain value systems or values levels, are actually motivated by feeling like they belong or having relationships. And now they're being completely excluded. Or nobody ever walks into the factory. They all stay in the office. So there's a big silo between the actual office and the factory. So those people disengage just by default because their most important need is not being met. So I think that I'm very excited. I think engagement is a very, very big thing that for South Africa. I think that if something that is amazing comes out, it will be really great.
It's interesting. I mean, these points, Mary, that you make. It's almost at a certain point, and Matt will just now chat about the evolution of this idea of employee engagement. I think it's a good point maybe to go there. I think in the early days of employee engagement, and I guess many things that come out of in the past trying to structure the employee experience has in its nature been actually quite bureaucratic and instrumentalist. And the absolute complexity of our world, as you mentioned, different levels of values, different cognitive and etc. abilities, different cultural experiences, etc., means that in a way one almost has to go to a deeper level of understanding what you mean by engagement and what you mean by experience. Engagement is not just, you know, those 12 things or those 15 things, and experience. You have to think a bit about what we actually mean by experience. And also, I think part of the question also is, where exactly is the experience generated or created? Where does it exist? And how do you support it at that point where people actually have the experience? Not as some vague category called the employee. Because I think sometimes I think this is part of our challenge, is this word employee, which is such a catch-all. It just needs to contain everything in a 10,000 person organization. It's impossible. And then we do all the marketing tricks, we segment, etc., etc. It doesn't really help, does it? Maybe because we segment in funny ways. We create more divisions rather than getting to the universal of the experience on the one hand, and then the particularity of each individual's experience. I guess those are the questions that really fascinate me, you know, from an OD perspective. Yeah. Folks, I think we need to, let's move on. I want to hear from Matt.
Yep.
Mr. Willis Towers Watson. Matt, you have done years and years in work in engagement and come to understand engagement in a particular way.
Yeah.
And then engagement itself, as we already said, it evolved. Well, it's clear that engagement, the idea of engagement, doesn't disappear. It's still incredibly important. We know it's like tons and tons and tons of research that says better engagement leads to better performance. And I don't know, in a way that's actually, you know, at this point quite obvious. We almost don't have to say that. It's a sort of a logic. But then where does this engagement come from? So what's the story? How did we get from engagement to employee experience?
Okay, fantastic. And just before, and if you permit me to share a few slides, it will help sort of share our perspective. I just wanted comment on a couple of things. Firstly, Dustin, what you were saying around production environments. And one of the big frustrations we have working with organizations is that they feel engagements can be driven in the white collar population. This is sort of around corporate. And there's little you can do in production environments. It's command and control, and that is the approach. Let's not worry about it. And to the other point about inclusion, absolutely not. We've seen production environments, engagement in production environments really shift and lift. And I think it's the interventions that more, I guess, modern thinking leaders are adopting. People want mastery and control over what they do. And you can do incredible things in production environments to get people to see the connection of what they do to the purpose of the organization. We've seen organizations switch production workers out and put them into the field to sell the product, just to see how that can, see what other skills they have and how they can make those connections. So I think it's fascinating, production environments, and I think you're doing exactly the right thing, pushing the envelope on that and seeing how far you can sort of change the culture, because everybody wants fundamentally the same things: having control over their work, feeling important, feeling valued, and having an impact, and seeing that connection. Sorry, I just wanted to address that one because it was such a good point. And the inclusivity piece and the fact that organizations often want to create one culture that applies to all, but we just know it's not the case. You're going to want a very different culture in your sales and marketing environment to your R&D function. There's no way that's going to be the same culture, or your production environment. So thinking about it in a segmented way, and using, survey results and other listening tools to build something that is unique and relevant to a particular function is more important than trying to build this culture that is all-encompassing and applicable to all. So there were just a couple of thoughts on those pieces. I'm going to share my screen quickly. And actually, I did want to show that slide too, because it goes back to the point we were talking about at the beginning of the conversation around working from home as well. But this is how we've seen the field evolved. I've been in the field for about 20 years, and I've worked very globally, actually. So it's, I'm based in the UK, but I don't just have a UK sort of view of things. I've been developing our Africa market for the last 10 years, actually, working across Africa in different organizations. And I think so many of these things are true across all organizations in all sectors. But this you may be familiar, depends how long you've been in the field, but am I happy here? Satisfaction is where it all started. And that seemed to be the ultimate measure. But then people very quickly realized you could have very satisfied but unproductive workers. So you weren't really getting far. So then the concepts around commitment came into play. So how committed are people to this organization? Do they feel a kind of connection to it? And then I guess the big change was around discretionary efforts. So you're satisfied, you're going to stay here, but I actually, whilst you're here, I want you to be your best self here and be as motivated as you can, bring your energy and your passion and help the organization succeed. So that was a very pivotal moment as engagement was formed. Probably about 20 years ago, this kind of full concept of engagement was there. And I think this is where business leaders got extremely interested, because for them, engagement was around, well, how can we get more? And how can we get more for less? Because, we were going through, different global financial crises. People were cutting workforces, so restructuring. So how can we get more out of people, give us a competitive edge? So I think it was a really interesting juncture for us as a consulting firm. This is when business was booming, because everyone was doing an engagement survey, and leaders and managers and HR were really, really interested in the results. Then what we saw, and engagement was highly predictive of business success. And you could very clearly see it was directional. The more you engaged people, the more successful the business became, and then that played back. A successful business gave people more energy, so you almost had a circular effect. But what we noticed probably in about 2010 or a little bit earlier, a bit of a drop-off in the ability of engagement to predict business success, and we're beginning to question, have we got the right measure here? So many organizations and academics too look to expand the definition of engagement to think around the psychosocial well-being at work. So do I have the energy? Do I get a sense of accomplishment from my job, wherever it is, be it a production environment or in an office? Do I work with colleagues who I get an energy from? So the psychosocial well-being, and also having the tools, so being enabled, but also we talked about bureaucracy a moment ago, but reducing bureaucracy so that I can really apply myself and have the biggest impact. So when we added those two elements to engagement around being energized and enabled, suddenly we could predict business performance again. It was a very strong correlation. So we realized that we're onto something here. Organizations need to be able to sustain engagement levels, because the other risk is burnout. And I think in some ways we're coming full circle back to that, because during the pandemic, we've seen very, very high levels of working hours and burnout. It's become the big theme for the last 12 months or so. And finally, where we are now, and this is the transition we're making, is towards employee experience. And that's our definition is the sum of all touch points and moments that matter. So that can be any moment, significant moment in your experience in an organization, from the day you walk in, the fact that the leader came and spoke to you, shook your hand, your onboarding experience with colleagues, the norms of saying hello to people when you enter the office, or do people just look down at their desk? All those tiny little moments, how leaders respond to, I don't know, good news, difficult news. These are the moments that matter, and this is the employee experience, and it's much more of an all-encompassing view of the world. And I think my final point of view on sustainable engagement is, I think the concept was a great one. It was the right one. I think it ended up in the hands of leaders too much. And you might well be familiar with this in your roles. It's a KPI that people measure, people track, and it's less about what you're doing about the results and how you're shifting the needle. Whereas employee experience very much gives power to people. You shape it, your voice shapes it. Whether you stay in the organization, whether you leave, the reviews you leave, the way you advocate for the organization, all have a big impact, and leaders of organizations are recognizing this. So it's a huge shift now to employee experience. Leaders must shape the journey. I don't believe that employees, it's completely democratized in that employees should tell leaders which direction strategically to head in. I think they have to listen, they have to reflect, and they have to respond. But it may not be always the voice of the people, but they certainly need to listen and be seen to act on certain things and perhaps reject other things, but they need to be listening so people can see that they have that impact.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It's a very interesting shift that you described, the shift from, and I wonder if this is something that happens to many approaches at some point, is that it's a good idea, it has impact, and then it becomes, as Marie said earlier, it becomes a tick box exercise in which certain things are done. I just reflect now also on what I've seen with culture surveys over the years. People would do a culture survey, and then 2 years later they would do the culture survey again, and then they have that 2-year cycle of doing the culture survey, but nothing ever changes. And I think it must be very disheartening for employees. to have to fill out the, and then to get measured on whether you have, you know, there's a KPI for completing the culture survey. It's not even the KPI anymore for actually shifting the culture or transforming the culture. Something that I mentioned to you when I spoke earlier in the week is it's exactly this point of impact, Matt, and I think that there's two parts to it. I mean, the first thing is what I've seen over the years is articles about, and really for the past 20 years, articles about employee engagement and the numbers. And I think it started, people are to a large extent still in the Gallup way of describing whether people are engaged or disengaged. But what puzzled me was that over the 20 years, the ratios have stayed more or less the same.
Yeah.
Why is, what happened? Is it a matter of maybe we need to look at it differently and measure something else? Is it a shift in expectations over the same period of time?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one we get asked quite a lot, and I think Gallup has, you know, had a great name in the market and has had a measure, and in some ways their figures feel very widely reported and given a lot of credence. It's a particular way of measuring it. It is not the only way to measure engagement. So when we look at organizations, if you look at the questions, and I'm sure this would be the case in a Gallup survey too, or other providers, if you look at people who are positive about questions around engagement, you're going to get 70, 80% of people ticking those on average across the organization. But if you look at how many people are always positive on all of those elements, you get a much lower number because, you know, for example, if one of your questions is, I have a best friend at work, well, you may not, but you may be fully engaged otherwise, and that just may not be, you may have set a boundary there. So I think it was a tall order to ask for people to be positive on all those elements of that engagement index. We expect people to have a varied work experience and bring their own personalities, introverts or extroverts, to work. So I think they can be a little bit demotivating when you see some of those reported engagement scores, but we would see it certainly north of, 60% highly engaged, and on average, positive regard towards an organization, sort of around 80%.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
It's almost, when we had we decided this is what engagement looks like and then measured everyone against it. And now it seems there's a shift away from that towards, well, what would make you actually feel engaged? What kind of experience is it that you want, rather than telling people what sort of experience they should have in order to be engaged?
And I think that's absolutely right. Crafting unique employee experiences for individuals wherever they are, whatever type. I think that's what organizations need to do and need to think about. And when you're describing the values or the culture, you need to be describing it in a way that it could be tailored to a particular group. The same for purpose. A purpose obviously has an organizational purpose, and you have your unique purpose as an individual, and you've got to find a way to make the link, and organizations that define it in a way that allows people to make those links and tailor it are going to have a much more successful approach to this than those that are trying to apply a one-size-fits-all approach.
Yeah. Matt, so if we, one of the things about employee engagement and the employee experience is that it will make the organization better. It will make the organization perform better. It will enable the organization to keep the people it really wants and to get the people make the best contribution to the organization, all of those kinds of things. It will have a huge performance impact. So part of it is this a strategic decision?
Did you hear like?
Just mute. There's a strategic decision to prioritize employee engagement and experience. And that needs to happen. And that's the first thing, it needs to happen. Then leadership needs to figure out, well, this is important and it's going to have a big impact on the organization and actually needs to be a priority. Then I guess what we need to do is we need to understand what we are working inside in the organization and what it is that we want to transform, what it is that we want to shift. And this is where I'm curious about the Willis Towers Watson methodology. That I mean, we know there's a whole lot of software and survey software, et cetera, that sits there. That's very powerful. And there's a lot of detail there. But before we even get to that, what is it that we pay attention to, that we measure, that we think, okay, you know, this is a metric that I should shift?
Yeah. And thanks, Krista. And you know, I'll share a little bit of our view, actually, because I think it would be helpful at this point. But also just to your first point there, absolutely, leaders need to signal that this is important. So if you're an organization is going through the motions every year, not shifting anything, I bet the most likely reason for that is leaders are not asking about it, and they're not asking their leaders, well, what are you doing about employee engagement? And if senior leaders do not pay attention to this, nothing will happen. It just drops off from the radar. If my leader's not asking me what I'm doing about engagement of my people, it's not a priority. I'm going to focus on my P&L and profit and growth, etc. So that's the first thing to make it happen. Leaders need to own it, talk about it in their blogs, just publicly demonstrate how committed they are to it and hold their leaders to account. I just wanted to share with you our model. So I've talked about engagement. Actually, maybe I'll step back one moment. Here's our definition of engagement, and it's very much an outcome. So one of the misnomers is people calling a survey of 50, 60 questions an engagement survey. Actually, the engagement questions are a very small subset of the whole questionnaire, and they're in there to measure the state of mind of people. So in this first box here, do I believe in what this organization does? Am I proud? Would I recommend this organization? So the emotional connection, and would I go the extra mile? So that's part of it, but it's very much a state of mind. It's the energy and the connection I have. But then it's also, am I fully enabled to be my best self at work? And finally, the psychosocial well-being at work. So do I get a sense of accomplishment? Do I have the energy? Do I connect with colleagues? And so that is an outcome measure, but it's not something you can work on directly. So it's a little bit like retention. If you want to stop people leaving the firm, you can't sort of just close the doors and say you're not leaving. You have to look at what was the experience that led them to leave. And it's the same for engagement. You can't fix it. You've got to look at the other elements of the work experience that are going to drive this. So in a way, this is your outcome measure. And this is our model: engagement enabled and energized. A lot of vendors, you would have come across similar types of models, but this is our model. It's probably one of the more expansive models, with about 6 to 9 questions, depending on how you want to run it. The link to having a high performance experience and business performance, we establish this link time and time again. This is just a recent study of ours of 120 organizations looking at those offering a great employee experience versus those that didn't. And you can see, or even versus an average employee experience, up to 3-4 times improved revenues, profit margins, return on equity, assets, etc. But probably the most interesting piece of research we've done over recent years is to look at about 700 organizations we work with over the last 10 years and to try to understand what comprises the employee experience in totality. What should we be measuring when we're looking at the factors that might influence engagement as an outcome? And this is what we established, and this has worked. This has been sort of empirically proven over different geographies, different sectors. It's a very consistent picture. People come to work for a sense of purpose, and that's from a very basic level, just understanding what I do. I'm looking at the left column here, understanding what I do and how it connects to the organization's strategy. But as part of that purpose, I need to feel included in it. I need to feel fully included in the journey. I can be myself at work. Anyone from any diverse background is welcome here and can be part of this journey with the organization. And through to the top, the purple box here in the far left, inspiration. So feeling totally inspired by what we do. I actually see what we do beyond just profit generation for the shareholders, but this organization is contributing in a positive way to the world. So making that connection. So that's what we call purpose. The other element around the work experience is the way work gets done, simply. And at the bottom here, the essentials is just being organized and efficient and knowing where things are, having structure. But then moving up this, I guess it's a evolutionary curve in a way. I'll talk to that in a moment, but it's having a voice in the way things are done. So that begins to differentiate performers. So not only we organize, but I can actually have a say if things are going to be done differently in whatever environment I'm working in, corporate, production. I need to have a voice to finally being really agile in the top box here, agile ahead of the market, innovative, and really customer obsessed or end user obsessed. So that's how work gets done. How I'm rewarded is obviously absolutely key. So this is more classic EVP that I'm sure you're familiar with, fair pay. Obviously fairness is most of the time more important than actual pay. It's the fairness of how that appears to be distributed, but this is benefits, rewards. But then it's how am I being performance managed? Is it fair? Is it reasonable? Is it clear? How am I developing? To the top here, feeling fully actualized at work. So a real sense of I can be my best self, develop to my full potential in this organization. And then finally, people, the other fundamental part of EX is the manager. When I talk about support here, really talking about manager support and that connection to a line manager or supervisor. Then moving on to collaboration in the light blue here. So how do I get on with colleagues? And finally, relationship with leaders in the top box here, the trust. So leaders who are visible, who are honest and open in their communications. I can speak up freely. They will listen. They will consider. And the reason this model is so interesting is that what we found was the bottom row here, the essentials. Most organizations are striving to get right or do get right, but actually they don't differentiate the best performers. We've looked at a group of organizations that are high performers, both financially as well as employee engagement. And what they do particularly well is the top row here, around inspiring, driving, growing people and building a sense of trust. And also the middle row, they make people feel included, give them a voice, capability and collaboration. So what we found is that if you've reached a certain level of manager support and it's okay and you're on par with benchmark, you're not going to turn your organization into a high performance organization. You need to be looking at this top row here to really drive high performance culture. That makes the difference. These ones are essentials you need to get right, but will not turn you into a high performing organization. So in a nutshell, and probably do it a little bit longer than I thought, but this is our model. This is what we would measure with about 50 questions. And then you can see how you are doing in each of these quadrants.
That's fascinating. I mean, what struck me about the model is that there's a kind of a progression in organizations. There's a progression of employee experience. There's a very basic or essential experience. Then there's almost the first level where your agency is ignited or opened up, where you are included as an employee. But in the third, the purple layer above, that is actually the place where the employee actually really have a voice in the organization to a certain extent. I know it's voiced there in the second row, but I mean in a different way, as really included in their whole being as people.
Yeah.
In the work and the endeavors of the organization.
Yeah.
I wonder, Beatrice, if I may quickly, if you make an interesting point, Matt, don't take it away. You make an interesting point around people being very satisfied and comfortable, and yet they're not engaged. I wonder if you look at those 12 elements, that where would the gap be? Where could the gap be? What is happening that people are satisfied, comfortable, actually they're not doing anything at all. They leave when they can. Well, they don't leave. It's too nice there. But actually not. I sometimes, Beatrice, Pat, I think of David Graeber, the anthropologist who died last year, who spoke about bullshit jobs. It's jobs that you know actually makes no contribution anywhere, but you still do it because you get paid for it, which leads to depression and all sorts of things in the long run, I think.
Absolutely, and Krista, I think that and perhaps it was Beatrice who made the comment, but yes, that satisfaction layer here, it's very much the bottom one. You know, I know what I need to do. We're pretty organized, get fair pay. Manager seems all right. I'm okay. But is it a really fulfilling life? And I think it's only as you begin to have a voice, you feel included. And the chances are something's not quite right for those individuals. Perhaps they're not feeling fully included. Perhaps they've never been asked how would they do things differently or managed in a different way. So absolutely, this is, you know, the blue here, which is good for businesses, but it's good for people. You know, people get stuck in ruts and they need to be kind of shaken out of that. And it's where you have this personal agency in organizations and where they need organizations, and this is where leaders and managers come into it, they need to help people find their voice, find how they can have an impact in the organization, and break down these silos. So yeah, and absolutely, it's a journey to the top, but we find just, why wouldn't we want everyone to be feeling they've got a real sense of agency in the organization and really fulfilling their potential? It's good for business and people.
It's, I mean, earlier you said, well, there's a number of points. One is around it not sticking this work, and I want to go there and say, okay, so we have this. How do we? And there's a lot of ways in which we can put out, etc. I want you to talk a little bit about that. But it seems to me also that if you want to have this kind of organization, it's not just a number of things that you need to do in the organization. There's a whole shift that needs to take place in the leadership way, in the way that the organization is led, in the way that leaders and employees engage with each other.
Yeah.
That might bring out all the voices, allow all the voices to, and allow all the people to participate. I see Barend's hand is up. Barend?
I'm just interested in one particular thing, and that's what I would call the direction of trust. If we look at what's conveyed here in the quote, it says, I'm confident in leadership They treat us with dignity and respect. I'm sometimes wondering whether what's happening with us as organizations now is trust coming the other way. In other words, to what extent do I trust a remote worker to be getting on with things? You know, and it goes to the whole thing of I want people back in the office so I can control them. And I'm just wondering how that comes through in the model, or I mean, it's implied. I understand that trust is a two-way process, but I'm almost looking at it from the other way around, if I can put it that way.
Yeah, it's really interesting question, and we do have some data on this, but this model, we've been tracking employee scores over the last 18 months to see how has the pandemic and working from home impacted things. What we've found is almost all of these have gone up. So actually people have felt more connected with people than ever. This is really surprising. They've felt much more trust with leaders and leaders vice versa. And they've felt more inspired by the purpose of the organization. So I think it's given an opportunity for leaders, particularly smart leaders, to make a connection between what they do as an organization and how they can respond in this pandemic helpfully. So we've seen an improvement across the board. The only ones that didn't really improve were being organized. So we've seen that organizations have struggled to be effective and to do this sort of continuous improvement and eliminate bureaucracy. We've seen an increase in bureaucracy, I guess, as people handling remote working. But everything else has actually improved, which has kind of confounded what people thought might happen.
Yeah, that's fascinating and counterintuitive.
Yeah, and there's, if anything, there's something we're coming across, call it visibility paranoia. It's just you're sitting at home and you're feeling, well, who am I? I'm not in the organ. They don't see me in the organization. How do they know I'm here? And so people set up meetings. They turn up to meetings. They try to have a say in every meeting. So you're getting this conflation of meetings happening because people want to be seen and they're worried that they're sort of disappearing. So it's running counterintuitive, actually, to what we would have predicted.
It's interesting that people want to be seen. I mean, that's and you know, the sense that you disappear if you're not seen. I think it's very much in our social nature.
Yeah.
And it's and that in our social nature, to a certain extent, also when we're in crisis, we do tend to pull together rather than pull apart.
Yeah.
So your point around leaders using this as an opportunity to, number one, learn, and number two, really make this the way you lead going on, and developing it in the whole leadership ethos of the organization, probably.
Absolutely. I hope these lessons stick, because I think, you know, who hasn't found it, you know, rewarding to see a leader struggle just like we do, and with kids running in and out and phones cutting off and all these challenges, and revealing more about themselves than we've ever seen in the sort of division between the corporate life and the home life. We're suddenly seeing people as humans. And they're asking us how we are. Their leaders are calling us up and saying how, you know, wanted to check in you that you're okay. I hope that these sort of softer skills and this emotional intelligence that leaders have had to display continues, and we don't go back to a business as usual, which I think is going to be problematic for firms, for sure.
Matt, you don't use the term research. You use the term listening, which is also a subtle but very important shift. Can you talk to us a little bit about listening? Why use listening, and how do we listen?
Yeah, I think it's a much more interesting word, and listening sort of conveys that you're not just measuring. So one of the the normal reaction as well, there's this thing called engagement. We've got to measure it. We've got to nail it down, have a number, and it's a measurement. But listening means that it's an active process, and there are lots of ways to do it. So we're not arguing that the survey is the only way to do it. It's a very helpful way, and often organizations will use it as a baseline. But it's got a few problems. One is that it's kind of trapped in a kind of an annual cycle. So we're seeing a move towards a continuous listening mindset. So you might be pulsing the organization on a regular basis, could be every quarter or a month on a few questions, but then you're talking to people. So I think it's that dialogue. And in some ways, I think the word listening might need to evolve a little bit further into this concept of a dialogue, because I think employees can no longer wait for managers and leaders to try and fix employee experience. I think it's incumbent on every individual in the organization to have a say. We did some really interesting research on which companies move the needle the most on engagement. What did they do over 3-4 years? The organizations that developed team-based action plans on the back of the results outstripped by far organizations that went for a top-down approach to listening and responding. So it's about, right, here's the problem. I've got some ideas as a leader what we could do about this, but I need all of you to contribute and help shape this. So I think it's moving from listening to dialogue. It's surveys, it's other ways. We're finding a lot of traction with something called a virtual focus group, which is a very inclusive event, and you go out to about 400 or 500 people, and you can get them to, you pose them questions in the chat and you get them to respond. And we know people are very comfortable typing rather than speaking up in an all-staff meeting. So you get some really interesting dialogue and consensus on what the organization do. So that there's lots of listening tools out there. And of course, you can't beat just speaking to your team about this. This is what the results say. What do you think about this? Yeah. So it's active listening and it's continuous listening. And I think that's the big trend. And that very much is one of the links to customer research that is effective. The organizations do that extremely well, the continuous listening and adaptation. Organizations are going to have to do it on a much more rapid basis and continuous basis.
What's so interesting for me about listening and dialogue, and in our practice, conversation and dialogue is really the keystone. There's no transformation that happens in an organization really without conversation and dialogue. What's so interesting for me is that the act of listening itself, the act of dialogue itself is really the first intervention in starting to develop or transform the employee experience. And it is the start that makes it more or less sustainable. I often, when we think of intervention in organization development, I think we think there's we're going to find out some stuff, and then we're going to create some interventions to fix some stuff. And so there's a split. There's a we hear what's wrong, and then we go and we change. And of course, we need to do that. But the very way in which we engage around what is and what is coming into existence and what is transforming as an employee experience is the first intervention. In your experience working, if I can, because I see we only have about 10 minutes or so left, I want to move to the sort of, okay, but now what? You know, we've started the process around engaging the employee experience. What do we do? How do we all show up, and what is it that we do to make sure that in a year's time we don't sit and we're still facing the same stuff because nothing has changed? Yeah. How do we sustainably transform the employee experience? And one of my questions there is, what are the sites? And with that, I mean, where do we work? What interested me very much is that you said that some of the best listening is team-based.
Mm-hmm.
That would suggest to me also that some of the most effective transformation of the employee experience is team-based.
Yeah, yeah. That's absolutely right. And you know what we're doing is we're trying to flip the psychology of this from the, I guess, the dreaded engagement survey that nothing happens on to something that is an organic living tool or process that everybody is involved in. One of the techniques we've employed recently is individual feedback. So once you've completed your engagement survey, I guess you're thinking, well, I'll submit it and then I'll wait 6 weeks for some results to come back. But actually you get your own action plan instantly. So it says, well, you scored low on personal development. Are you aware of these things that you can do to further your career in the organization? Here's a link to our careers portal. Here's a link to the jobs we're posting. And actually flip the psychology so that they realize that, oh, I can do something immediately about how I feel. I think it's really important because if you think about it, if you've got an organization of 10,000 people, you can either rely on 50 managers to change it, or you can have everybody, all 10,000 people moving slightly, is going to have a huge impact on changing the culture. So I'm not saying it totally sits with the individual or the team, but it happens at the same time. An individual can shift their mindset instantly. Teams work on results together, and leaders steer the ship and steer the course and say, well, that's not quite the direction we wanted to go in. We listen to you. We don't have to do exactly what everyone's saying. We're going to try and steer the ship, safely and successfully. So I think all those three things need to happen in parallel to shift the organization.
It seems to me that point of the point of people taking more responsibility for their own experience. I know that's a two-edged sword because it's sometimes used in coercive ways in some context. But here it really is about bringing about the realization that you actually have agency inside the organization, and then through leadership making sure that there is actually that you actually do have that agency, that you're not going to just do stuff and run up against a wall.
Yeah. Absolutely, that you can have an impact. And I think colleagues will see that those who do have that agency are beginning to get ahead, and they can either follow suit or decide that this company is not offering the right employee experience for them. They want something else. But you want to sort of activate from the base and create that sense of personal agency. The other thing I would say, and you asked about sight, so I agree, it's at every level you need to activate, but people mustn't feel that this is an additional thing they need to do. So one of the challenges we often say to organizations when they say, well, can you come and give us our leadership team an action plan based on the survey results? And we say, absolutely not. That there isn't, if they don't have a people strategy in place, the survey is not going to give that to them. We'll happily give you a course correct plan. We'll hear about what you're implementing, what is your people strategy, and what light does the survey shine on that, and where do you need to course correct? And I think that's the same for managers. This is a tool to supplement what they're already doing. We don't want to say this is another thing you need to do. This is to help you or to self-correct and adjust plans that you're already doing. So it should feel seamless and aligned to a whole process around continuous organizational change.
It seems to me that from a leadership perspective, that if you adopt employee experience as strategically important for the organization, it needs to be very tightly integrated in whatever you do in the leadership development space.
Absolutely.
It's not there's leadership development and there's employee experience. It is leadership development itself becomes part of developing the employee experience and vice versa. I see there's a question from Marie.
Thanks, Christo. Fortunately, you just answered it in that last section. My question was, I'm assuming that employees actually need to have a level of agency for this to work. Because if I look at that top tier around growth that says, I'm achieving my potential, it assumes the individual is quite self-aware of their potential and realize that they actually need to drive it as part of this engagement process. So yes, my question was around agency, and fortunately you've just answered that.
And I think sometimes there is a role for a leader. You know, some people may not be able to find it on their own. And I think great leaders or managers are able to spot this individual unique strength that somebody can bring to the organization and help them to achieve that. So sometimes it's a little bit of a push and pull to get there.
Yeah. I think of what I think it was Beatrice said earlier. For some people, what's really important is belonging, because that's the level at which their own development is, and in that phase, you need to actually be helped to start to think of your own special potential, to start to differentiate from the in-group, and that certainly requires a wise and a present and an engaging kind of leadership.
Yeah.
Good. Well, I think that we covered a lot of ground, Matt. We didn't cover like a quarter of the field, but we did cover.
No. Yeah, Krista, do you mind if I just leave this slide on for just a moment, because it's so relevant at the moment, and we've done some research around what is the work experience at home versus in the office. And actually we found that people who work from home report a better EX than people who work in company locations. People find it rewarding, it's part of the deal. People love that flexibility, so it's almost being used interchangeably with reward. We're finding executives enjoy it, but they struggle with the collaboration. So they're reporting the lowest levels of collaboration. So it's not perfect, and executives seem to struggle, as do people with longer tenure in the organization, but they are more likely to stay with you working from home. So we're going to have to reset and think about this differently, because the evidence is not there that people don't produce, are not effective. In fact, it's the opposite. So I just wanted to share that with you.
That's very interesting. When you say that the executives struggle with collaboration, is it amongst themselves? That they struggle to get the organization to collaborate?
It's both of those. So they struggle to get collaborative sessions with other leaders, but also feeling that they can get teams and departments to collaborate together for their perceptions on that.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Are there more questions from anybody? I would love to know from you in the last few minutes that we have.
I have a question. It's Karen here. Having recently been through a process where the company ran an engagement survey, one of the things that this company grappled with is so very much the approach where it's team-based conversations. To what extent, though, do line managers need support in terms of holding those team-based conversations? And from two perspectives: one from a capability perspective, in a kind of an older-fashioned bureaucratic organization, but also from a capacity in terms of running operations. And so I just would like to understand from that, maybe, what is the approach generally in terms of providing the support, and where does that support come from? Is it HR?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, often HR business partners or a network of champions need to support managers, and you're absolutely right. Some managers will be sort of, I guess, less enlightened and try and fix it all themselves. Others, it will come very naturally too. So it's slightly in your selection of managers, but you have who you have. And I would say, yeah, it's a network of business partners. We do train the trainer sessions just to enable the champions and the HR business partners to work with leaders and managers about having those conversations and letting go a bit and letting the team come up with solutions, even if they don't think they're the best, but it's more important to let the team run with certain ideas. So sure, that's the networks we would rely on.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Good. Any more questions? Is anything from you?
Yeah, Christy, just before we finish, we've got a minute left.
Yes.
Maybe use that minute to tell everybody about our certification that we launched.
Yep, do that. So we're launching what we call the Employee Experience Practitioner Certification, which is a 5-day program. It's 5 days split up over time. It's aimed at people who are practitioners in the organization. So it's typically the people who will support the employee engagement and experience initiative. And in this program, you will learn things like how do you make the business case in the organization, position employee experience strategically, what are the implications for the organization in terms of leadership, the role of leadership, what's the work and the profile of the employee experience facilitator, etc. That's the first part, which we call concepts, employee engagement and experience concepts. And then the second part is practice, where we go into much more detail around how do you design this listening process, and in the listening process as well, how do you design and develop the employee experience. And then the final part of it is the project. How do you run and engage in the project? How do you scope and design for interventions to start to transform the employee experience, etc. Matt, anything you want to add to that?
No, that's it. It's just fully to equip you to do it, and it's relevant for everyone, because every leader is also needing to enhance their listening ability, the ability to harness the employee voice. So we're really excited to embark on this.
Great. Well, we've run out of time. So I'd like to just thank everybody for coming, for listening, for engaging, for asking questions, for being here. You've all got at least my email address, because the invitation came from me and the reminder came from me. So please feel free to drop us a line if there's anything more you want to find out, if you want more information on the certification. And then I will get a few of the slides from today from Matt and share it with the people who has actually attended the workshop or the audio talk. So thank you, everyone, and hoping to see you again soon. Thank you so much, Matt, for joining us. And thanks, Christy.
No problem. Thanks. Great to talk to you all.